Hello, good morning, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on the Central Bank's review of compliance with MAR. My name is Adam Kalesha, and I am specialist in MAR compliance at EQS Group in the UK, where we provide digital solutions to company secretaries and compliance professionals, including insider list management software, regulatory news dissemination as an alternative to RNS, policy management system, whistleblowing platform, and gifts and hospitality register. I'm delighted to be joined by our panelists Eugenie Mulhern, Sean Mckeown, David Kearney, and Catherine Lehmann. Eugenie Mulhern, Senior Advisor at A&L Goodbody. Eugenie's key areas of expertise include capital markets, securities law, corporate finance, M&A, and corporate governance. Prior to joining Goodbody in 2018, she has more than 15 years' experience working as a director in corporate finance in one of Ireland's leading stockbroking and financial services firms. Sean Mckeown is Company Secretary and Head of Risk and Compliance at Delata Hotel Group. He joined the company when it was founded in 2007 and led the finance team before being appointed to his current position in 2017. He previously worked in senior finance positions at a number of Irish companies. Interestingly, Delata were one of several companies selected for inclusion in a more detailed supervisory review of its governance arrangements in relation to the market abuse regulation as part of the CBI's review. David Kearney, Head of Corporate Broking at Goodbody Stockbrokers. David has over 20 years' experience in corporate finance, equity capital markets, and corporate broking, helping companies engage with and access capital markets. He's been with Goodbody for 15 years. And finally, Catherine Lehmann, Managing Director of Lehmann Credit Limited. Catherine is a regulatory compliance consultant with a background in both professional practice and the financial services industry. She has over 30 years of experience in regulatory risk and governance within the banking, insurance and financial services industries, including the FCA. Welcome and thank you for being on our panel today. Before we start our discussions, I'd like to briefly go through the webinar console that you have in front of you. I won't go into too much detail, but just draw your attention to the Q&A icon, which should be highlighted for you now. Please add comments and ask questions as we go through, and we'll discuss them further at the end. So in today's webinar, we intend to discuss aspects of the topics specified by the CBI's areas for improvement. We aren't going to look at the subject of enhancing trade surveillance and store reporting frameworks, as we felt that this is a big enough subject to warrant its own webinar at another time. What we will discuss, however, is an issuer's experience of being part of the CBI's review, the process around identifying and controlling access to inside information, improving the quality of insider lists and related processes, and approaches to training and raising awareness. We will also be requesting a bit of audience participation in the form of a poll. We're going to kick off with a poll question, and there'll be a couple more as we go through the webinar. You'll just need to click the relevant answer in the dialog box. Okay. So if we kick off with the first poll question, how do you think you would fare if the CBI asked for a deep dive into your processes and controls for compliance with the market abuse regulation? Very well, we have excellent processes in place that are regularly tested and reviewed. Quite well, we feel that we are compliant, but there are probably areas that we can improve, or not sure, there are some areas where I have concerns. So if we just give you a couple of seconds to put your answers in there, and then we can have a look at the results of the poll. It should be ready any second now. And do we have those results? There we go. Okay, so majority quite well, fairly small percentage think very well, and the rest not sure. So let's move on to the first topic, which was what the CBI identified. So this revolves around public disclosures. Issuers must implement better frameworks to ensure their public disclosures of inside information are made in a timely manner. Sean, I'd like to come to you first. Having been asked to do a deep dive into your processes, as I mentioned at the beginning, what changes have you made around your frameworks and controls? And is there anything else that feeds into this?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Adam, and thank you for the invitation to speak at today's webinar. A very interesting and very topical area. Yeah, it's interesting. When I think about, I was thinking about the question, I would have been in the 75% answer, I think, and having gone through the process of the thematic review with some more scrutiny than the market in general, it was very interesting. And I struggle with this word framework. What do you mean by framework? In particular, when we're dealing with subject matter that's not that, the source of inside information can vary from time to time, and there's a lot of judgment around, whether a particular matter or piece of information is or becomes inside information or not. So you can't neatly put it into a little box and tie a ribbon on it and it's all perfect. But the experience that we had was that we really thought about things in much more detail. So I don't know what the page count is on my my before and after set of policies and frameworks and so on, but it's a multiple. So we've documented an awful lot more detail. And what we were really pushing to get ourselves to do is understand how should we think about this in the right way. And we looked carefully at our behaviors and what are the things that we do that put us in position to comply effectively with the market abuse regime. So, for example, we thought about, more carefully about, how it is that a person we share. If we, let's say we have inside information and we're in a position to say that we're delaying disclosure, and we have all of the thought process and all of we're clear about our decisions and our positions in regard to that, and we need to put an individual on the list, the process by which they're put on the list, and who's controlling the security of the inside information. How does that work? So we thought about having when we determined that we have, even before it's inside information, confidential information, we think, well, who's the person who's responsible overall for the security of that information? And are we talking here about, information security in an IT technical perspective, or are there other things we need to consider? So, you look at every, event or project on its own merits and think about the things that we need to do to comply in that circumstance. So it really forces us to think more deeply about how we comply, and we would have felt we had good processes there before. But the process or the experience of being challenged to think more deeply was a very good one. So we feel very fortunate to have been one of the companies to have been chosen to have closer scrutiny, because it forced us to really reflect on how we manage compliance. So we've kind of come back together. I don't think, we're going to do, I think as things move along and move forward, I don't think that the work of compliance is going to be any more necessarily, but I think we'll be more clear-headed about what we're doing. I think we'll hopefully be more confident about our approach to compliance. We kind of nutted out some questions that we mightn't have really thought as carefully about before. How exactly do you do that? How exactly does that work? How do we link up what we do, between those executives who might be in the front line in terms of projects where inside information may occur, and the linkage through to disclosure committee and us on the compliance side, and aligning announcements and all of that. So we just went into a little bit more detail.
Great, thanks, Sean. I guess it's just taking that step back and looking at it a bit more holistically to see where you can improve areas. Eugenie, I'd like to come on to you now. Apologies, I should have mentioned at the start, we've had a slight technical issue with Eugenie where you won't be able to see her, but you will be able to hear her, which is the most important part. So Eugenie, obviously you work with a number of issuers and have done in response to the CBI letters. What would you say are the key elements of a good framework in relation to inside information?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'd echo some of Sean's comments there. I think the key areas for a framework are, it's important that it takes into account the realities in the company and really makes it as easy as possible for that company to identify, assess, manage, and control information, but also to demonstrate that that's what it's done. And, the market abuse regime is a complex regime. There are multiple regulatory sources, there's guidance, there's technical standards, and that's been compounded for Irish companies which have a London listing by the addition of kind of UKMR post-Brexit. So I think a good framework kind of brings all the definitions and the interpretive elements together in one place in plain English and ideally diagrammatically, and that allows the people who are, making the decision with respect to the assessment of inside information to understand what are the elements that go into that decision. And I think then, keeping up to date on key developments, so having a process in place that allows you to have a kind of a fresh understanding of, what are the developments, such as with respect to, for example, protracted processes, or, how do you think about the direction of a price movement? Could it be positive or negative? What does that mean? How do you think about, mitigating factors and balancing past and present, positive and negative news? So items like that, where we've got kind of key learnings from, particular sanction cases in the UK, which may be relevant, or cases at an EU level, such as the Daimler case, for example, where a chairman was socialising a decision to resign, and there was a judgment that wasn't inside information because it wasn't a final decision, but that was, ultimately held to be erroneous. So making sure that kind of knowledge is available to the disclosure committee, if it's a disclosure committee making an assessment. And then I think having a bespoke menu within the company of the types of information, which, all other things being equal, may well be a red flag to consider whether, a development may or may not be inside information. So, for example, a very acquisitive company may not think small bolt-on acquisitions will be significant developments or have any kind of price impact. But a company which, say, rarely makes acquisitions and hasn't flagged its intention to do so, or where an acquisition kind of would be interpreted as a change in strategy, they should think very differently about it. So we've done a lot of work with companies to try and put together a kind of not an exhaustive list, but a menu of the type of things which, in the context of that particular company, should be a trigger, if you like, for that decision. Is this something that could be inside information? And then I think also looking at what's gone wrong for other companies in terms of some of the cases. So, cases like the David Massey case, where, there was a judgment that because a transaction was, consistent with previous transactions, it didn't constitute inside information, and that was held to have been an erroneous judgment. So building in kind of factors like that. And then I think once, the first half of the framework is really around identifying and designating information. And then once that decision is made, it's really having an action plan that is documented in terms of what happens and who is responsible for making it happen. So that's around, the decision to announce or delay, the 3 conditions that you can, when you can delay, your insider list preparation, your holding announcement, monitoring the market, etc. So all that process, if it is inside information, then if you've decided it isn't, what's your process? Are there further steps? Is there further analysis? So again, documenting that so it's clear that, there's an action plan in place. And I think we've also seen the CBI kind of look for policy documents around how the company communicates with the market. So kind of guidance for their investor relations team, etc. And in putting together those and building them into a good framework, we've kind of looked at what are the categories of information, a particular company will communicate to the market on an annual basis. So kind of breaking them down into 4 different categories, and then having an action plan in terms of how that information is likely to fall within the realm of inside information or not. And really, I think it's about thinking about, the framework is a tool to allow the company to comply with the market abuse regime. And it really is about looking at information kind of from the point of detection or origination of that information right through to its release or its kind of downgrading that it's not inside information. And I think everything in that framework has to be looked at through the lens, which the CBI have been very, very focused on in their review of, the whole purpose of the regime is market integrity, and it's about equality of information. So if the company's framework being informed by the objective of promoting that market integrity and ensuring that information is disseminated to the market without delay when it's material information.
Great, thanks, Eugenie. Some really helpful insight there into how you're helping others in this situation. David, I'd like to come to you now. What do you see? Obviously, you work with a number of different companies as well. What do you see them doing in terms of putting frameworks in place?
Thanks, Adam, and morning all. And hope you're all doing well in these days. But I think both Eugenie and Sean made some very interesting points, and Eugenie kind of talking about, this can be very specific to a company or a set of circumstances, but really the focus should and needs to be on process. And I think as a general rule, I kind of always think of the hindsight test. So how have we documented how we've kind of assessed or handled information, and then what's our governance pathway around thinking about things like who's on insider lists, or indeed then how do we disclose that information to the market in a timely fashion, as Eugenie left out and are said there. And I think it's probably worth just kind of reflecting in the first instance on the assessment of information. And clearly, like Mar sets out what inside information is, but even just to kind of set that out, because it's always a topic of discussion with companies, and it's constantly kind of refreshing the memory on it. And I think most people feel they know, but sometimes you have to get into the specifics of it. So, there are a couple of different tests, but one is the information precise, which doesn't, from a language perspective, actually means something a little different under MAR than it might in ordinary use. So it's really, are there a set of circumstances which exists or which may reasonably come into existence, or is there an event that has occurred or reasonably be expected to occur? And that really means, there's not, that doesn't mean that it is more likely than not, but just that it could be reasonably expected. So it's above non-negligible, but it's below that kind of 50% threshold. So that's maybe the first big test. And then the second big test is if that information became public, would it have an effect on the price of the relevant security, so your share price? And that there's probably a judgment call under both tests, but certainly under the latter test. And I think the example that Eugenie made there, a very acquisitive company might find kind of bolt-ons as non-material in a market context and in a share price context, but clearly a company who doesn't very frequently make acquisitions and makes, say, a class 2 acquisition, is that something that might necessarily become inside information at the relevant time? I think from a process perspective, a lot of companies have created disclosure committees, and some are considerably more formalized than others, but virtually everyone is going down this road. So that typically involves, CFO, IR, COSEC, sometimes the CEO, but not always. And really, that's a framework for documenting, for assessing the information that's created by the business with reasonable frequency, and then having a forum to assess it and document that assessment. And again, it's back to this hindsight test. If the regulator comes and asks, what is your process and procedure, you have a forum where this information is discussed and aired at a senior level, and then you have an opportunity to display in hindsight how you've documented the decisions that you've made, because some of this is judgment call, and it's hard in hindsight to kind of, without an evidence path, it's hard to satisfy the CBI requirement that you have properly assessed and handled that information and disclosed it in a timely fashion. So that's the disclosure committee is really the fulcrum, I would say, for from a governance path and from a framework perspective in terms of dealing with the MAR issue more generally.
Thanks, David. I think the hindsight test is a great thing to use in this situation to really make sure you're thinking about this in the right way. We're going to move on to the next topic now, and we're going to ask you another poll question to kick off. So the next poll question: how are you currently managing your insider lists? Manually, via spreadsheets or email, software provided by a third party, proprietary software, or another method? I'm not sure what other methods there are out of that, but let's see. So we'll just get you to give your answers quickly, and then we can have a look at the results of that, which should be quite interesting, I think. So we should have the results any second. And there we go. Okay, so still a fair proportion on spreadsheets and email, which is slightly surprising. But yeah, most people are covered by spreadsheets or a third-party system. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next topic from the CBI. So this revolves around insider lists. So issuers and their professional advisors must improve the quality both of insider lists and how the operation of those lists is governed. This includes writing to insiders to inform them of their moral obligations and the consequences of committing market abuse. Catherine, I'd like to come to you first on this. Obviously, with your background, you can look at this from a regulator's perspective. And I'm sure our listeners would be intrigued to hear what you as a regulator are looking for from issuers in this regard.
Thanks very much, and hello, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join your panel today. From a regulator's perspective, so I was a regulator for the better part of about 12 years in London for the UK regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, and I have to say, when you're looking at firms and reviewing their documentation, their procedures, what they've got in place, because you see so much in so many different firms, you get very used to being able to spot quite quickly, even just from talking to people, whether what they're using is something that is very much in use day to day. People are very familiar with it, they're comfortable with it, they can talk to it, or they're kind of pulling something off the shelf and blowing the dust off it. Doesn't happen that often these days because a lot of people don't have print, but you know, you sort of get the analogy. It becomes really obvious. You can tell, is someone using it? Have they just put something together in order to answer a question, or actually it's really, really part of BAU? That's really important. As a regulator, ideally, what you want to be doing is going to an organisation where that organisation is showing this is very much our kind of bread and butter. This is what we're doing every day. We're very comfortable with this. We're using this all the time, and it's really up to the minute, current kind of information. That's the preferable situation to be in. But there are occasions where you have to put something together last minute, and I have to say, putting something together last minute is a far better place to be than having nothing at all. There is nothing worse than sitting in front of a regulator and saying, oh, I haven't got anything at all. So if that does mean a couple of post-it notes, preferably not, preferably that Excel or better still a system, have something, be able to demonstrate you've got something. That's really, really important, and always sort of try and remember to do that. Some smaller firms tend to say quite often they're looking for something that's proportionate. They're a smaller business and they're trying to apply their regulations proportionately. I would just exercise some caution with that. Think about what proportionate means, particularly in the context of your organisation, because proportionate in a smaller framework, a lighter kind of policy or procedure or training or whatever the approach is, heavily relies on a very strong culture, meaning that your people have got to deeply understand what it is that we're expecting of them and what it is that your organisation is expecting from them. So I think you just need to keep that in mind. What the central bank will be looking for when they're asking to see your documentation, your procedures, for example, with the insider list, they will expect it to be a really tight list. Name individual by individual, so not this team, that desk, that group mailbox, whatever. Individual by individual, specifically why that individual should be wall crossed, One of the very, very common kind of early issues we had in the UK when implementing MAR was that people were thinking, if I wall cross Catherine and her team, then we have to wall cross Catherine's line manager and the boss above and the boss above, or just the head of department. With insider lists, you have to think outside of the organisational chart and the reporting lines. You have to think about why that particular individual, even though someone's supervising an individual, they don't need to be wall crossed. They don't need that inside information to supervise what they're doing. So you have to think very thoughtfully about each person as you're adding them to the list. And as we've talked about already, you've got to think about the governance. So what's the role of your committees in reviewing insider lists, not in terms of the content, but in terms of the approach, making sure that there's a robust approach to it. Again, if you're asking your governance committees to review the list, then you're potentially having to wall cross everyone on that committee. And it starts becoming very, very problematic then to be able to manoeuvre as an organisation if you're doing that, particularly if you're working on multiple deals, for example. You're creating too many conflicts and it becomes very, very difficult to manage. That's the sort of thing that the central bank's going to be looking for. We'll expect you to be managing, to be alive to. If you haven't got a disclosure committee, use some other committee that you've got already, because nobody needs endless committees if they don't need them, but just think more practically about that. And certainly, we've touched on hindsight reviews, but actually my experience as a compliance officer in some of the big banks over the last 10 years or so is that the regulators do have a very common habit these days of coming to you quite often 5 years after transactions happened, asking for you to replicate that transaction 5 years later, and that can be really hard to do. And that's something you've got to be really alive to and be prepared for and think about. If we're asked that question about something that happened 5 years ago, how are we going to be able to put that information together and demonstrate that we were trying to do the right thing at the time?
Great, thanks, Catherine. That's really interesting to hear that from the regulator's perspective. I'm sure that'll be very useful for our listeners as well. Sean, I'd like to come back to you. Excuse me. Obviously, having been through the process with the CBI, what kind of key changes have you made, and what advice would you give to other issuers around managing their insider lists, given the experience you've just gone through?
Yeah, in terms of changes, we were one of those who used a spreadsheet system from the initiation from 2017 or thereabouts, 16, 17 onwards. And we've moved to a third-party software. We were planning to do it anyway, but I suppose it sort of shimmied us along when we were going through the thematic review process. And it's that I think sort of helps to, to consolidate everything in one place. I often think, as an accountant, there were lots of great spreadsheets I had over the years, and as time's gone along, you've seen someone's created a product that has replaced my spreadsheet, and I said, God damn, there's another business opportunity I missed. But what you have in a third-party software is, it just gives you more certainty and assurance around date stamping, time stamping, and all of that. Just a bit more security around it. In terms of our, I think, behaviours, not a tremendous amount is going to change. We would have always been alive to, events coming up and thinking about the possibility of the need to look at an insider list. And, timing, for example, and it's interesting, Catherine mentioned about meetings, and in two events that I can think of, we were having a meeting about a matter, and we said, hang on a second, we have a quorum here for our disclosure committee. So the meeting became a disclosure committee meeting, and we determined in that conversation that we had inside information, and our process was kicked off. So it wasn't a case of, oh no, we've got to find the disclosure committee, so we're alive to that and present to that event. And I think in some ways, as I was reflecting on the question, I'm not sure whether or not the regulation requires that the record be electronic. I think it possibly does, but in some respects, there's always that spreadsheet risk piece that always worried me, because it depends on your again, it depends on your how well that spreadsheet or Word documents, how well they're put together. And the user's expertise and comfort and proficiency with, say, Excel or a spreadsheet, that you don't make an inadvertent error. It's so easy to make a silly mistake with those, the Microsoft programs. They're fantastic, but you've got that inherent possibility of making an error. The other thing that I think is interesting about having a third-party system is that it's a funnel through which you can put all your communication. So we're going to create a dedicated marcompliance@delatahotelgroup.com email address. And so even though we're using that system, any emails that we publish through that system will come from that email address, and all our correspondence in connection with market abuse matters should come from. So me or my colleagues who are communicating with colleagues outside of the mandated, shall we say, communications that we would send, we will use that email address. So it'll be Sean Mckeown on behalf of Mark Compliance. So you'll always identify through that. So all our stuff to do with Mark Compliance is in one place. All our correspondence is that email account working in tandem with the third-party software. So it just takes out some of those. And it was interesting going through the process, the attention to detail that the central bank put on certain things. So there was one of our lists, there was a cell that wasn't filled out, and I was surprised the attention that it was a member of a team who was added to a list, and there was one field that was it was just a copy and paste error. Literally, that piece of information was missing, and I would have said, it's clearly obvious that was a clerical error, and it was, but that detail was there. They were interested in that detail. So that really kind of heightened me. So we really want to watch our P's and Q's here so that we have a tight record. So I think there's certainly an advantage. And as we mature in our approach to compliance, it's probably for most companies, I think that's something you want to have a good look at. I know for smaller companies, they've got some of the costs and expense, and it is. And if you've got a good system, if you've got a good spreadsheet system, you're confident of that, great. The point about electronic was, in some regards, a lot of those spreadsheet errors are taken out if you simply had a manual system. I mean, if you had pen and paper and you were diligent and you knew your compliance, I can see how you would actually eliminate some of the spreadsheet risk by actually going in reverse back to analog. But I would just review it, have a think about how secure and how well trained and how well the people operating that know what they're doing.
Thanks, Sean. That's really interesting to hear the difference between the manual process and then obviously the third-party system. Eugenie, I would like to come to you very briefly, if we can, just to if you can maybe give a couple of the main areas of weakness identified in relation to inside list administration that you've come across with your clients.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's the human error element, but also kind of a weakness in approach, if you like, in that I think historically companies would have thought a good insider list was a long one. Whereas I think, the theme underlying a lot of the central bank work is that actually companies need to be really thoughtful about who they're putting on the list and why they're on it, and documenting that. And that it really has to be a need-to-know basis. A short, complete list is the objective, really, because that demonstrates not only that you have good control of inside information, but also that you've prioritized integrity of the market in kind of protecting the flow of information within the organization. So I think the key areas of weakness that were identified were kind of lists that are too long, inadequate explanations on the list as to why a person is on the list. So in lots of cases it was like, is an insider was the explanation, and that isn't appropriate. Like the central bank want to understand that this person is on the list because they need to be on the list, because they're an advisor or they're fulfilling a particular function with respect to a transaction. Lists not being updated on a timely basis and not being date stamped when they are updated, in that the central bank needs to be able to kind of take a cut of the list at any point in time and see what it looked like then. So every time it's updated, it kind of needs to be date stamped in some way. And then I think acknowledgements not being collated of when people are put on a list, that whole process that happens behind the scenes in terms of them being advised of their responsibilities and what they can and can't do, and then acknowledging that. And typically that doesn't always happen, in that there's delays, and obviously it typically is the case that when you are opening an insider list, there is a lot going on in the company, and the company secretary, who is probably responsible for its administration, is extremely busy. So that follow-up on the lists and collating acknowledgements has been an area where there have been some weaknesses. And I think anyone who's ever run an insider list, will recognise that problem. So I think those are the key areas that were identified.
Brilliant, thank you. Very concise, much appreciated. Just another reminder, please don't forget to add any questions you have through the Q&A icon. We're going to move on to our final topic now, which revolves around training. So we're going to bring up the poll. What methods are you using to provide training and improve awareness in relation to MAR compliance? E-learning, internal workshops, external consultant, or email notifications? This is quite an interesting area that I think many companies have different methods on, probably slightly driven by budget, I would imagine, as well as just the way they do it internally in their company. So if you can all just give your answers into there, and we can then have a look at the results of that. I expect it's probably a bit of a mix, but we'll see what comes back. Yeah, there we go. So e-learning is the top one, and then we have internal workshops and external consultant are the main other ones. So if we move on to the final topic, so market participants must improve staff awareness of and training in MAR. In particular, training needs to be more comprehensive and specific to the risk the entity faces in the context of its business activities. Catherine, I'd like to come to you first. I know that you conduct quite a lot of training in your business. So what are the key elements of a good training program that our attendees could perhaps take away with them today?
Thanks, Adam. I'd say when people were voting for the poll, I was willing the responses to come in for a bit of a blend of all four answers. And we broadly have, actually, because the best type of training program that you can have recognises there's different levels of information that people need. I spend, as you say, Adam, a lot of time at the moment. MAR is the hot topic at the moment. Everybody wants to know about MAR, whether they're in Ireland, they're in London, they're in Singapore, they're in Hong Kong, Austria, Dubai, around the world. Lots of people just want to know about MAR compliance and market abuse compliance particularly. The best type of programme recognises that, first of all, you need people to be generally aware. So you'll have a very large population of people who need a general broad awareness, and they need to keep that broad awareness fresh. And whether that's an email campaign, actually I've seen people put posters up in company lifts, screensavers have changed. There's a whole range of ways of just keeping that information out there and fresh and up to date. And that way you're keeping the topic in people's minds, not because necessarily they are perhaps coming across things that look like potential market abuse day to day, but you just need them to be thinking about it in case they do. Right through to your next category of people who will need to have a certain level of information to have a slightly deeper understanding of what the regulations are. And so more of a general information and knowledge transfer, which is what you usually get from the e-learning type training programs. Those are by far and above the best and the most cost-effective and efficient ways of training people, and a large number of people on sort of core knowledge transfer. And then you get into the groups of people where actually you need to do something that's really role-specific. What's the individual doing day to day? And how does this particular regulation apply to what they're doing day to day? So coming up with really practical examples that are completely relevant to what their job is and what they're doing, and making it very kind of specific to the individual or small group of individuals, allowing them the opportunity to ask questions, to demonstrate their understanding. Some people even go as far as doing a pass-fail type test or an engagement kind of test, just so that they can demonstrate that individuals have really kind of been present during that training, rather than just passively attended, perhaps sat at the back of the room with their mobile phone on. which can happen sometimes. The key thing always for me with any training is making sure that individuals being trained, by the end of that training, understand how can you protect yourself personally. Because market abuse is a regulation that can come to the individual, where an individual can be prosecuted as much as a firm can be prosecuted. For that reason, I always think training on market abuse has to bring the personal element there and make it very clear to the individual, this is what you can do to protect yourself.
There we go. We've done it. I'm on mute when I was supposed to be speaking. Thank you, Catherine. That's really helpful. David, at Goodbody, it'd be interesting to know what you do for your own staff in terms of training around the subject.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I imagine we massively over-index versus a regular issuer, just given the the CBI supervisory element and the regulatory framework that we operate in, and the need and desire for a very strong compliance culture. So we do all of those things. So we have e-learning, annual e-learning with tests, so that there's a demonstrable understanding among staff, and that's to all staff. We use for parts of the business, like in the corporate advisory business, clearly we have kind of high frequency access to inside information, so across multiple issuers. So that's a kind of a very sensitive and very sensitively managed and very rigorously managed. So we do workshops. We get lawyers to, that's with consultants like Catherine. We use law firms like Eugenie to also do workshops. We do internal workshops. We even have pop-ups on our desktops, not just on MAR, but a variety of kind of compliance-related issues and other kind of technical issues. And yeah, regular kind of reminders. And then there's a whole bunch of processes and procedures that people need to attest to and also demonstrate awareness of through various kind of testing as we go through the year. So, like I said, it's a fundamental requirement of our business. So I suspect we massively over-index in that regard.
Yeah, I suppose it is. It comes with the territory to some degree.
Yeah,
Sean, from a issuer's perspective, what do you guys do in terms of the training, especially having gone through the review now?
Yeah, well, we've done some external training, and again, I would think about the training part of it. I almost think of what our learning and development department or the LAT Academy tell us all the time, that in learning, 70% of the learning is through experience, 20% is through others, and 10% is through the structured part. And we tend to talk here about the structured part, which is only a small part of it. And I think particularly in areas like this, there's a real risk that people think, well, it's more important that I have the person's name as ticked off as having been trained than whether they actually received any knowledge through that training. I loved what Catherine said about the whole area. It was really, really on point in terms of it. You've got to think about what you're doing to make sure that you're protecting the company, you're protecting the individual in this situation. So when you think about the work that you're doing in the space, are you doing that? Ask yourself that question. And those of us who work as secretaries, I think we have to be considering that every engagement, every moment is a moment of training. One of the things we've debated about is, the frequency of disclosure committee meetings and the schedule meeting versus being agile and on point, like I described earlier on, where we pivoted effectively into a disclosure committee meeting. But I think there's real value in the regular scheduled discussion, whether it's tagged on to the executive committee meeting or whatever forum is appropriate, because what it's doing, it's keeping it live. I mean, that in my opinion is a piece of training. That's a 3-mile jog in the park once a month. So it's keeping it alive. And every time we speak to a colleague about market abuse, about this stuff, we are training, we're educating. So it's training, it's education. We have to, I think, take the view that we're trying to protect our colleagues and our company, and we're educating all the time. So it's yes, there's that formal piece of it, which is part of the compliance piece you want to demonstrate, but I think you need to think more broadly than that.
Great, thanks, Sean. Good to hear that from a issuer's perspective as well. I think that brings us to the end of the main sections, but I'm keen to get on some questions that we've had from our listeners, which I think are really relevant and interesting. So the first one, which we've had from a couple of listeners, is should board chair or another NED be a member of the Market Disclosure Committee? I think I'd like to come to you, Jeannie, on that one, if you'd like to go into some details on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adam. I mean, I think it depends. Like, in general terms, I think most companies don't have a NED on the Disclosure Committee. But I do think, it's important that firstly, the Disclosure Committee needs to be able to meet quickly and to, make a decision promptly and to be informed. So, it needs to meet that, to be able to meet that criteria. It needs not to be an echo chamber either. So, we would often, as advisors, get calls about, do we think this is inside information or not? And you kind of know that, the company want a particular answer. And I think it's important that whatever the constituency of the Disclosure Committee is, that they're able to objectively look at what's happening, apply the tests, and decide, properly, do we think this is inside information or not? So if that can be done with an executive team, and obviously the executive members will have much better insights into, what are the market expectations and how have those market expectations been created? Has that been through proper dissemination of public information, or is it kind of selective knowledge? So one way or the other, the Disclosure Committee needs to have available to it all relevant information in terms of market expectations and any other factor that is built into the assessment of inside information, and it needs to be a robust process. So that if that can be achieved with executive members only, it can also be achieved with a combination of executive and non-executive. We certainly wouldn't think the Disclosure Committee should be exclusively non-executive. There should be an executive director's contribution as well to it. And I think most terms of reference will accommodate having being able to invite additional people onto the Disclosure Committee or to contribute to its assessment, whether that's brokers or financial advisors, legal advisors, etc. So it depends.
Sure,
would be the short answer.
Thanks. Sean, do you have any executives on your Disclosure Committee?
Any non-executives, you mean?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, we don't, and we've discussed it, and we share minutes of Disclosure Committee meetings with the board and so on at the appropriate time. But we opted not to. We just felt from, it might feel an obligation, we've got to find that non-executive director. Can we reach them? We want to reach them, and we just felt that we wouldn't. But it has been something that we've discussed at board level. Just so we've aired it, and we've given the non-executives the opportunity to input into that, and we've had a conversation about it.
Okay, thanks. Another question that's come up that is very interesting for me, because I speak to a lot of company secretaries about their insider lists, and I'm still very surprised of the number of companies that still have permanent insider lists, and fairly lengthy ones at that. So we've had a question on what the panel's view is on permanent lists. Catherine, perhaps I'll come to you on that one.
Thanks, Adam. I'd say permanent insider list, you need to keep it as short as possible. Long lists of permanent insiders could look to the central bank like you haven't really got sufficiently robust controls around how you manage inside information, and you're not keeping it under regular review. The other, actually far more important piece is that permanent insiders still have to prevent and manage conflicts of interest. And those conflicts are much more likely to come up if they're a permanent insider. And it becomes incredibly difficult for them to manoeuvre and discharge their obligations as an employee of the company if they're permanently wall-crossed on everything that's going on. So I would say keep them really short and keep them under regular review as often as you can, and take them off as often as you can, and if necessary, put them back on.
I think there's another point to that, which is around issues that it could raise in the future. So if an insider is incorrectly categorised as a permanent insider and shouldn't have been, and the regulator comes back in a few years' time to say, you clearly had information about this at this time, inside information, and your neighbour made a transaction in your company's shares, they would say, well, I didn't know about this project, I wasn't included, but you were on your insider list, you were included as a permanent insider. The regulator's not going to accept their explanation that they shouldn't have been on that list, are they?
Absolutely not. No. They expect that once you're on that list, that at that point in time, date, timestamp we were talking about earlier, that you received that information, you have actually received that information, and therefore you are in possession of inside information. So to come up with a defence that says, oh, I didn't have it, so I was just on the list, shows that the control framework is defective, ultimately.
And I think on talking to a lot of company secretaries, there's a sort of legacy issue from Excel sheets of putting everyone in as permanent, as being on the safe side, which was probably the early thinking when MAR first came in, and continuing that once you've moved either off Excel sheets or if you're still using them. So it is advisable to be very careful and review them, as you say, regularly. Another question we've had is around insider lists of who should be included on an insider list. For example, should third parties who may not be advisors be included if they come into contact with inside information? David, I think I'd maybe come to you on that one.
Absolutely, yes, is the very short answer. If you're a discloser of information, anyone who has received that from you needs to go on an insider list. You need to document the time and place and reason for the time and reason for that disclosure, and ultimately that person needs to acknowledge that they understand all of the obligations of being an insider and you need to have documented that as well. So the function or role of that person is irrelevant, other than, from a regulatory perspective, only those people whose functions or roles require them to have access to this information should have it. But whether they're internal or external is irrelevant. So absolutely advisors and any third party who has been given access to the information.
Absolutely. Eugenie, would you agree with what David said there?
Yeah, I would, absolutely. And I think there was an interesting point coming out of the central bank letter to advisors, actually, reiterating to them their independent obligation to assess information they receive in terms of whether or not it is or isn't inside information, and to run their own insider list. So I think from a practical point of view, we have worked with clients to kind of update their letter of instruction to advisors around that. And I think it is a somewhat of an anomaly for advisors in certain respects where, in theory, they could make a different judgment than the company, and the company could have decided this isn't inside information. They discuss it with an advisor could, in theory, reach a different conclusion and run their own insider list, which obviously, in certain circumstances could put a company in a difficult position after the fact. So I think there are some kind of nuances there that need to be carefully considered. But absolutely, any person whom any party in the company makes an insider needs to be on the insider list. And even if there is delegation to an advisor in terms of running their own insider list, so you just keep the principal contact on yours, the obligation can't be delegated. It is still the issuer responsibility to make sure that insider lists are complete and up to date, etc.
And on that single point of contact, or that single insider from the outside, from the external insider, how much personal details do you require to get from them? Because I think it's become a little bit of a grey area. Obviously, MAR states that you need all of these personal details, but I've spoken to a lot of companies who've said that their advisors refuse to give all of that information.
Yeah, I think, it should be sought. And I said we would typically, have a template letter, if you like, that goes out to the advisor from the company. kind of documenting the protocols in relation to the principal contact, etc. And if it's the case that you ask for the information and it's not provided, then I think that that there is very little you can do about it. But you need to have evidence that you sought to fulfil your obligations, in every respect.
Sure. So you've got the kind of the trail of request of information, even if it's not been fulfilled.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I think we're now pretty much out of time. So first of all, thank you to the panel for your time and your expertise. You can now see on the screen some useful information and content that we have in terms of blog posts and white papers on our website. I'd also like to just draw attention to the short survey. It takes literally 1 minute to fill out, and we appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. And like I said, thank you again to the panel. We really appreciate your time and expertise. And I'm sure we'll be doing more webinars in the future, which we'll inform you all about. So thank you.